So, thank you so very much for being here. I really feel I need to make an introduction beyond what I did last night, but I'm also aware of the fact that it's already close to 10 minutes past 1, and I really want to give the floor to Elia. I just want to thank you all for being here. It's really wonderful that there is obviously so much interest and enthusiasm. I do want to say that you know, Elia really is one of the most important and dedicated teachers of architecture of the recent past, if we can put it like this. And one thing that I didn't say last night, because I was talking about Elia and Rem and Zaha, is that, you know, I was also personally very lucky that at one point there was the idea of something called the super unit. And a super unit was a unit that was like bigger than all the other units by a factor of 3 or 4 or something like that. And last week we had Richard Rogers here, and many of you participated in that. One of the things that we didn't really talk about in terms of the history is that when Rogers and Foster started, they also started their practices together with their wives. And Richard, at that point, was married to an amazing lady called Sue Rogers. She actually was not an architect, but she was, I mean, I guess her background was more in issues to do with sociology and the built environment more broadly.
She became an architect.
She became an architect, and she actually then, when she separated from Richard, she married another architect and is happily sort of practicing and is in London. We can maybe talk about that on another occasion. But Elia and Sue also had this studio, which is like the equivalent of an option studio for at that time what was called the intermediate school, before he was in the diploma school. And they were together with Sue, but then they also had Alan Cahoon, I think Norman Foster was in that studio, 2 other Greek professors, Thalis Argyropoulos, I think, was there, and so very interesting sort of alternative form of pedagogy.
Alan Cahoon, you mentioned.
Alan Cahoon, yeah.
John Miller was
And John Miller. And John Miller is the person that Sue Rogers married afterwards.
and Patrick Hutchinson.
Patrick Hutchinson. So it's a very interesting idea of pedagogy that you actually have multiple voices, and this is a class of like 60 people, and I happen to be one of the students in that group, so I got to experience things firsthand, and it's really incredible the dedication that Elia has had to architecture, and of course through his founding of OMA at the very beginning, and then also, you know, teaching in many universities in Europe. He was a professor in Düsseldorf and has taught in Switzerland at Mendrisio and in many other places. So we're very happy that he's here. So please welcome Elia Zenghelis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Morrison. Thank you for reminding me of this. Really, I would say, kind of in a very sentimental way, kind of one of the best years of our lives. These were great times when we were still young. When we're still young, I mean, I think we just keep on dying while young. I think, as I've never been here before, I thought it was an opportunity to, and I've been asked to talk about my work, to actually show, because I cannot show everything, I'm going to just concentrate on 2 poles. And if you like, talk about the very first thing that I did that sort of became recognized, and then the most recent thing that I've been working on, the kind of the ends. And I thought that this might make an interesting, if you like, relay between the two ends, which I think remain, in my mind, remain connected. So the first project that we did, the four of us, you saw, those of you, I'm sure you were all there yesterday at Zaha's celebration, photograph that Moisen shown, where there's the four of us, Rem and I with our little suitcases, and our wives and collaborators, who are both of them painters, Madelon Vrissendorp and Zoe Zenghelis. Together, the first project that we did was in response to a very vaguely termed competition that appeared in the Casabella magazine, with a very vague title, "The City as Significant Environment." Rem, who had been my student until that particular moment, and we had just started working together, had completed what was perhaps one of the best history theses that were produced at the AA, which was a thesis on the Berlin Wall. Really very deeply studied and very inspiring study of the wall. And we decided to apply, if you like, some of the principles and conclusions that came out, of this idea of the wall, the kind of a primary element of architecture, and a primeval even element of architecture, which element which has something on the other side that we do not know, to use that in defining this, what we called the kind of answer to what Casabella seemed to be asking for, kind of a city, a significant environment. We decided to put that in the middle of London, to put two walls in the middle of London and form a strip. And within that strip, we put what we considered were essential collective facilities in order to revive a kind of a public realm that we felt was missing at the time. We remember Rem used to have kind of an expression about London. He said his expression was, "London is not a city; it's a holding pattern." And so we inserted these walls in the center of London, running through the center of London, forming a strip, and that was the first project that sort of won either of us or all of us a certain recognition. And this is what I'm going to begin by showing today, and also by reading the text that we had written. I've abridged it because the text is much longer, that went with it. So I begin with the text. Once a city was divided in two parts. Can you hear me? Is it one part became the good half, the other part the bad half. The inhabitants of the bad half began to flock to the good part of the divided city, rapidly swelling into an urban exodus. And incidentally, I ought to say that these photographs that I'm showing now just to try to explain. In those days, they were very well known through the newspapers. Today, they would probably not mean very much, but they were photographs taken from people trying to escape from East Berlin to the West when the wall started being built in 1961. If this situation had been allowed to continue forever, the population of the good half would have doubled, while the bad half would have turned into a ghost town. After all attempts to interrupt this undesirable migration had failed, the authorities of the bad part made desperate and savage use of architecture. They built a wall around a good part of the city, making it completely inaccessible to their subjects. The wall was a masterpiece. Originally no more than some pathetic strings of barbed wire, abruptly dropped on the imaginary line of the border, its psychological and symbolic effects were infinitely more powerful than its physical appearance. If you want, we can lower these lights. I don't think we need them. The good half, now glimpsed only over the forbidding obstacle from an agonizing distance, became even more irresistible. Those trapped left behind in the gloomy bad half became obsessed with vain plans for escape. Hopelessness reigned supreme on the wrong side of the wall. As often before, in this history of mankind, architecture was the guilty instrument of despair. It is possible to imagine a mirror image of this terrifying architecture, a force as intense and devastating, but instead in the service of positive intentions. Division, isolation, inequality, aggression, destruction, all the aspects of the wall could be the ingredients of a new phenomenon, architectural warfare against existing conditions, in this case London. This would be an immodest architecture committed to desirable alternatives. The inhabitants of this architecture would become its voluntary prisoners, ecstatic in the freedom of their architectural confines. Contrary to modern architecture and its afterbirths, I'm not sure this is the right image anyway, this new architecture is neither authoritarian nor hysterical. It is the hedonistic science of designing collective facilities that would fully accommodate individual desires from the outside. This architecture is a sequence of serene monuments. The life inside produces a continuous state of ornamental frenzy and the decorative delirium, an overdose of symbols. This will be an architecture that generates its own successors. And this strip, shown on this map, describes the steps that will have to be taken to establish an architectural oasis in the behavioral sink of London. Suddenly, a strip of intense metropolitan desirability runs through the center of London. Two walls enclose and protect this zone to retain its integrity and to prevent any contamination of its surface by the cancerous organism that threatens to engulf it. Soon the first inmates beg for admission. Their number rapidly swells into an unstoppable flow. Oh, sorry, I'm terribly sorry, I'm going backwards. Okay, soon the first inmates will beg for admission. Their number rapidly swells into an unstoppable flow. We witness the exodus of London. London as we know it will become a pack of ruins. After crossing the wall, exhausted fugitives are received by attentive wardens in a lobby between the reception area and the wall. The consoling atmosphere of this waiting room is an architectural sigh of relief. The first step in the indoctrination program of the other side of the wall is realized. The newcomers enter the reception area. On arrival, a spectacular welcome is given to all. The activities inside the reception area acquire minimal training for new arrivals, which is only accomplished by overwhelming undernourished senses. The reception area is permanently crowded by amateurs who exercise an inspired state of political inventiveness, echoed by the architecture. The senses are overwhelmed, and the sole concern of the participants are the present and future of the strip. Contradictory programs fuse without compromise. The roof of the reception area is a high-altitude plateau from which both the decay of the old town and the physical splendor of the strip can be experienced. From here, a gigantic escalator descends into a preserved fragment of the old London. These ancient buildings provide temporary accommodation for recent arrivals during their training period. The area is an environmental sluice. The ceremonial square. The west side of the roof is completely empty, except for the tower of the jamming station, which will protect the inhabitants of the strip from electronic exposure to the rest of the world. This black square will accommodate a mixture of physical and mental exercises, a conceptual Olympics. This, and on the tip of the strip, is the front line of the architectural warfare that is waged on the old London. Here, the merciless progress of the strip performs a daily miracle. The corrective rage of the architecture is at its most intense in a continuous confrontation with the old city, with existing structures which are destroyed by the new architecture. A model of the strip, continuously modified through incoming information from the reception area, conveys strategies, plans, and instructions. Life in the building barracks of the tip of the strip can be hard, but the ongoing creation of the object leaves the builders exhausted with satisfaction. And that leads us to the Square of the Arts, which is devoted to the acceleration of creation, evolution, and exhibition of objects. The Square of the Arts is the strip's industrial zone. There are three major buildings on the square. One is old and has always been there. The other two were built by the voluntary prisoners. Of these two, the first building bulges from the surface of the square. And the second is carved out of the square and is the interior of the first. These buildings are instruments of indoctrination, exposing memory by allowing its vacuums to be filled with the onlooker's emotions. The visitor's first impression is of an almost infinite number of empty frames, blank canvases, and vacant pedestals. They can only decipher the spectacle by projecting their memories onto these empty provocations, a continuous film of images, improvements and accelerated versions of history and history of the art automatically produce new works, filling the space with recollections, modifications, and inventions. The visitors, driven by an irresistible power, begin a journey down the escalators into an exploration of the most mysterious corners of history. At the lowest gallery, they discover a bottomless interior. New galleries are under construction, filling as completed with unfamiliar works that emerge in a continuous flow from a tunnel that is seemingly connected to the old museum. Returning to the surface, the traces of the course are retained on the retina and transferred to certain parts of the brain. This hallucinatory journey intensifies the suspense of arriving visitors who wait outside the gates, forming endless lines, anxious with anticipation. The baths. The function of the baths is to create and to recycle private and public fantasies, to invent, test, and possibly introduce new forms of behavior. The building is a social condenser. It brings hidden motivations, desires, and impulses to the surface to be refined for recognition, provocation, and development. The ground floor is an area of public action and display, a continuous parade of personalities and bodies, a stage for a cyclical dialectic between exhibitionism and spectatorship. It is an area for the observation and possible seduction of partners who will be invited to participate actively in private fantasies and the pursuit of desires. The two long walls of the building consist of an infinite number of cells of various sizes to which individuals, couples, or groups can retire. These cells are equipped to facilitate the realization of fantasies and social inventions. They invite all forms of interaction and exchange. It is a private area and private cell sequence that becomes a creative chain reaction. Finally, in the arena they perform, the freshness and suggestions of these performances trigger a continuous explosion of ideas in the audience. Overcharged by this spectacle, the voluntary prisoners descend to the ground floor, looking for those willing and able to work out new elaborations. The Institute of Biological Transactions. The Institute contains the voluntary prisoners through biological emergencies and physical and mental crises. It also demonstrates the harmless nature of mortality. It is divided into 4 parts by a cruciform building. The first part, the hospital, contains a complete arsenal of modern healing, but is devoted to a radical de-escalation of the medical process, to the abolition of the compulsive rage to heal, no forced heartbeats here, no chemical inventions, no sadistic extensions of life. This new strategy lowers the average life expectancy and with it senility, physical decay, and exhaustion. In fact, Here, the patients will be healthy. The hospital, wait. The hospital is a sequence of pavilions, each devoted to a particular disease. They are connected by a medical boulevard, a slow-moving belt that displays the sick, in a continuous procession with a group of dancing nurses in glitzy uniforms, medical equipment disguised as totem poles, and rich perfumes that suppress the familiar stench of healing, in an almost festive atmosphere of operatic melodies. Doctors select their patients from this belt, invite them to their individual pavilions, test their vitality, and almost playfully administer their medical knowledge. If they fail, the patient is returned to the conveyor. Perhaps another doctor tries the patient, but it soon becomes apparent that the belt leads beyond the pavilions, through the cruciform building, and straight into the cemetery. The mood here is continuously festive. The same smells, the same ethereal dance, made still more human by the contrast between the ruthlessly formal layout of the plots and the unnaturalness of the dark green shrubbery. In the three palaces of birth, there is a statistical balance between births and deaths. The physical proximity of these suggests a causal relationship between the two, a gentle relay. The lowering of the average life expectancy creates an ambiguous urgency. The three palaces of birth will also care for babies, turn them into small adults who can participate in the strip. In the fourth part, mental patients will be on display, as in former days, as part of a well-produced exhibition of their delusions, sustained by the most advanced technical equipment, an infinite number of Napoleons, Florence Nightingales, Einsteins, Jesus Christs, and Joans of Arc, all in their custom-made uniform. Bureaucracy, as so often criticized for its moral blindness, guarantees a new kind of immortality. This statistical treasure produces not only instant recounts of the dead, but also premature biographies of the living, instruments for plotting a course and planning the future. The park of aggression, in this recreational area, rudimentary structures were erected to correct and channel aggressive desires into creative confrontations. The unfolding ego-world dialectic generates the continuous emergence of conflicting ideologies. The park is a reservoir of sustained tension waiting to be released, a gigantic playground of flexible dimensions to accommodate the strip's only sport, aggression. Here, conflicts are reenacted, the staged battles dissolve the corrosive habit of good manners. On an individual level, the park is a sanatorium where patients recover from remnants of old world infections, hypocrisy, and genocide. The diagnoses provide richer forms of intercourse. The most prominent edifices of the two towers, there are two most prominent are the two towers. One is an infinite continuous spiral, the other, consisting of 42 platforms, has a familiar architectural style. Magnetic fields between these two towers create a tension that mirrors the psychological motivations of their users. Entry to the park is free, and performances are continuous. Visitors arrive alone, in pairs, or in small groups. The aggressive confidence of the players compensates for the uncertainty about the safety of the square towers, shelves containing cells where visitors withdraw to vent suppressed hatred. But these private antagonists are also spectators. The shelves serve as viewing galleries which overlook the larger platforms of the tower, provoking visitors to join groups involved in unknown physical transactions. As remnants of shyness are overcome, visitors add their private energies to this incredibly demanding and mutant form of social behavior. In an agitated sleep, they ascend the tower. As they pierce each floor, their view of the activity below improves, and around the architecture of great heights, they experience an exhilarating new sensation of the unfolding spectacle. The entire surface of the park, the air above, and the cavities below becomes a full-scale battlefield. As the operations continue into the night, they take on the appearance of hallucinatory celebrations against the backdrop of an abandoned world. As they return from their nocturnal adventure, the visitors celebrate their collective victories in a gigantic arena that crosses the park diagonally. The allotments. To recover in privacy from the demands of intense collectivism, each voluntary prisoner has a small piece of land for private cultivation. The houses on these allotments are built from the most lush and expensive materials, marble, chromium, steel. They are small palaces of the people, palaces for the people. On a shamelessly subliminal level, this simple architecture succeeds in its ambition to instill gratitude and contentment. Nothing ever happens here, yet the air is heavy with exhilaration. The square of the captive globe. This square is devoted to the artificial conception and accelerated birth of theories, interpretations, mental constructions, and proposals, and their infliction of the world, on the world. It's the capital of ego, where science, art, poetry, and certain forms of manias will be allowed to compete under ideal and identical conditions. It will be an incubator of ideologies. From these solid blocks of granite, each philosophy expands indefinitely towards heaven. At the same time, these towers will be visualizations and symbols of ideas expectable of sublime communication. The changes of this ideological skyline will be rapid and continuous, a rich spectacle of moral fever, ethical joy, or intellectual masturbation. To express their everlasting gratitude, the voluntary prisoners sing an ode to the architecture by which they are forever enclosed. Although at first sight the metaphorical message of these proposals may seem to dominate practical considerations, this is not another utopian tale. The zone can be built today, if necessary, in segments, perhaps in a modified location, perhaps with the segments dropped like stones, apart from each other, and only connected by the overlapping ripples caused by their impact on the urban pond, like true social condensers. It requires a fundamental belief in cities as incubators of social desires, but also in the synthetic materialization of dreaming. If people were allowed to become acquainted with architecture, they would reappropriate the physical and ideological decay of our urban societies, and they would rehabilitate the premises of the metropolitan ideal and way of life. And this is the first project that, as I said, we produced together as a team. And that gave me a kind of a renewed interest in an architecture that is free of the dreary obligations that our present social and political reality imposes. One which is unshackled from conformity to the constraints of our institutional mediocrity. An architecture, if you like, that is itself, and that is not subjected to any of the constraints and regulations that normally in the practice of the profession one is subjected. I have become very allergic to, whilst I love architecture, and I'm, if you like, perhaps more committed to the idea of architecture than ever before. I have become allergic to the vicissitudes of putting up a building. I hate clients. I hate contractors. I hate subcontractors. I just hate the whole procedure of putting up a building. I also have come to realize that it has become impossible to realize a building in the present political situation in which we live that really is not compromised. I therefore have become more interested in the idea of architecture represented through images that in themselves speak a language about architecture, and a language that perhaps is divorced from the kind of realization of architecture within the existing political systems we have. Architecture is totally connected with the political realm. It follows the political realm. It is subjected to it, and the two things have to be in harmony in order for architecture to, at least in my mind, the way I dream of architecture, for architecture to be realized. I will now quickly run through some of the work that followed this, and I will just concentrate on the last projects that I did. So, as I said, I've become divorced. I've broken up with all my clients, and I only do competitions if the topic of the competition interests me. And the competitions are often not in order to win, but in order to represent through images ideas that we believe in. As you probably may have guessed, the Exodus used a lot of illustrations from actual prisoners, and because the idea was a kind of a prisoners of architecture, and Exodus contained the population of the project was prisoners. So very quickly, I'm not going to talk about early projects done for housing. This was a housing project. So I'm just now concentrating on the image rather than on the contents for a while. Projects done this was a competition for housing on Roosevelt Island. This was a project for kind of a strip of on Manhattan, kind of running from east to west. And this was the realization of the Square of the Captive Globe, repainted by Zoe Zenghelis. And this was the drawing that became more well known. And this was a project that I did again from Manhattan. It was a project on the confluence of Broadway and 7th Avenue on Times Square, facing the Times building. So it was a kind of a counterpart of the Times building. It was called the Sphinx Hotel, and was basically a response to kind of welfare housing where at the time the public was concerned and complaining that the people on the welfare hotels were kind of urinating in the staircases of the hotels. And I mean, I kept on saying, well, if you give them a Hilton, they will not urinate. So it was basically a luxury hotel, a kind of with a lot of I feel like ideological paraphernalia attached to it, like for in this case, the Lissitzky's Lenin stand, from where he was supposed to address the crowds. This was a kind of an axonometric of the facilities on what was the neck of the hotel, and this was the top of the hotel with a kind of a swimming pool and the planetarium over the swimming pool. And you could swim right to the edge of the pool and look at the Empire State and the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. This was a drawing that in which we had assembled all the projects that Rem and I had done either together or separately for New York before we returned to Europe. And this was the first project that we did as a competition in Europe, which was the new Houses of Parliament in The Hague, in which we did together with Zaha, about which I talked yesterday. This was an axonometric showing all the public circulation within the building, and the drawing that I did them for the same purpose, showing all the facilities available to the public. And this was Zaha's drawing for the level of the deputies and the detail. And then these were the competitions. As I said yesterday, Zaha and us kind of split. Zaha went on her own way, and we did this competition. We each did a competition for the Prime Minister of the Irish Prime Minister on Phoenix Park in Dublin. Our project that Zaha nicknamed the two bananas. Then a series of competitions for Berlin, for a project in Berlin. Finally, one which I did for a building on Checkpoint Charlie. Checkpoint Charlie was kind of one of the checkpoints from which you could enter from West Berlin to the east. This building was built, and I was lucky at least to have. This was this ground floor contained a garage, which was where the Allies would enter before they crossed from one part of the city to the other. This was a space that the museum at Checkpoint Charlie wanted to take over once Berlin was unified, and would have been a very good client. But of course, the actual clients of the building thought that he wouldn't pay enough rent, so they butchered the thing with a lot of commercial facilities. That's how it was originally. The roof of it, the wing hanging over, was to commemorate that this was the spot during the famous Berlin airlift in 1948. This was the point where the planes had to abruptly turn and start going up as they were not allowed to enter the East Berlin sector at low altitude, so they had to gain a certain higher altitude. This was a kind of a postcard from the time. Very quickly run through a project that I did then on a Greek island of Antiparos for private, for bungalows. A project that was never realized because my client started becoming competitive, and and he was from a good friend. He became a very irritating person. Just then, immediately after that, we did a competition for Parc de la Villette, which we should have won, but we didn't. And that was a kind of one of the first big disappointments against many things. There was then we were invited to do another park in Paris again, the Parc Citroën Cévennes. Again, we did not win it, and so it was. I'm just telling you the vicissitudes of the experience of an architect, which is one of the reasons why I decided to stop. Although the people who built the Parc de Cévennes, they did a very good job. I mean, it's a very nice park. Then a project that we won in Berlin, on Moabite Werder, where we had again a park on the River Spree. We won the first prize together with 3 teams who won the first prize, and all 3 teams were, although we had the first prize, the job was done by private developers without any attention to the prize winners. Even though it was a public competition. More work for the public in Greece, on the island of Cephalonia, again a park. At that point, I became extremely interested in the synthetic nature, the synthetic nature of nature. In other words, a park. And this was a project done for the capital, or the capital town of Cephalonia, called Argostoli, on a bay that was a polluted bay. So it was a kind of a project that was very much trying to kind of take away the pollution from the area, and also a beach. And these were the images in which we were trying to convey what we wanted. A beach again on the island of Cephalonia, and another beach-like project, which was again a hotel on the island of Lesbos, and finally another competition. We won the first prize. And it was kind of the in Brussels, in the city of Leuven. It was the Flemish Administration Center. This job was coveted by a local firm in Leuven, who, even though we won the competition. And even the council was forced by the city architect to give us the contract. Even so, we lost that contract, and it was taken over by that firm, local firm, that was that coveted the job, took part in the competition, and did not win anything. So it was and not only we lost the job to them. But they took our design and executed it in the completely wrong materials and completely wrong details, and so that was the kind of final nail in the coffin, of my profession. I mean, they said it. As a consolation, we thought, we were asked if we would design a garden for an old people's home near the Leuven Flemish administration. So we did this little design for a park, for this garden. This leads me to the two last projects. One done some 4 or 5 years ago. I'm selecting this. Done for, again, a competition for a park for the old international airport at Athens, the airport of Hellenikon. A job that is now being done by Foster. Oh, by the way, Foster was one of our tutors in that unit. Yes. So I'll run quickly through the project. I mean, the project was done together with Dogma. I mean, the last two projects that I've collaborated with Dogma in the two projects, one in Greece and one in Albania. We did everything I've done in my life always had kind of, whether visible or not visible, a grid. The grid for this one was kind of on a arithmetic progression, getting tighter towards the more urban parts of Athens and bigger towards the more suburban parts of Athens. And based on that, we kind of put the facilities that were required, which included a lot of commercial accommodation, but also housing and an international conference center. This was our project for the runway of the drawing for the runway of the airport. Underneath the trees, there were commercial facilities. And various images depicting kind of details of how we had conceived the park. As we did not know who the architects would be for the commercial parts, we just left the buildings black, and we just concentrated on the landscaping proposals. And lastly, the last project is the most recent one, done a year ago for the city of Flore in Albania, in which again we got nothing, but we took part in the competition to redevelop the coastline of that city. Our proposal was a series of piers going into the sea, and 4 zones that were kind of taking the existing situation, but just kind of tidying it up and intensifying it, which was a series of parallel zones that consisted of a pine tree forest, then a pedestrian boulevard that would run the whole length of the area, then the coastline, and then at regular intervals, I think it was every 500 meters, if I remember correctly, yes, those piers. With, of course, a more centralized part at the convergence of the most major avenues, which coincided also with the commercial center of the city itself, the city of Flore. The city of Flore is in a kind of protected bay, so it's not in the open Adriatic, so the sea is always calm. So these are some images illustrating what we meant and what we wanted, and how we saw the piers themselves being used and how they would relate to the continuous zones that were in front of the actual city itself. So they could be used for for leisure mostly, but also for a number of facilities. This was the overall plan, and that's how the kind of project was built up. So first the piers, then the boulevard, pedestrian boulevard, linking the piers, then the pine tree forest, then the various facilities incorporated within and giving the center, and the marina, and one pier becoming longer at the kind of center of the city, and also the weather, which coincided with the marina. Then the little confetti that we talked about, that Zaha had kind of named, the little facilities, some of them in the water, some of them and others along the coastline. And then the whole thing together with some of the facilities being floating on the water, which, as I said, was very calm because of the fact that Vlorë is protected from the Adriatic. It's in a protected bay. And a few more illustrations to sum up this project and at the same time this presentation. So we could, then some variations on the idea of the piers and how the piers could extend with additions and be modified and added on. The various different facilities that could take place on the pier at different times. At times it could be more congested, at times there would be fewer people on the actual piers themselves. In the early hours or the late evening there would be fishermen. And finally at night it could be used as an open-air cinema in a climate that really is absolutely wonderful in the summer. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Maybe turn the great if we can actually open this up as quickly as possible. I could ask one question, which is a sort of obvious one, in response to some of the things you said, Elia, and I just sort of feel it myself coming from a few meetings this morning. Last night I mentioned that one of the things that was really amazing about Zaha was really this question of her persistence, kind of staying with things despite all the difficulties, and when she didn't really have any projects for 10 years and kind of just keeping at it. And I think the provocation in a way that you build up by going through the Exodus project, but then actually also emphasizing the role of in a way the image, the drawing, and that's the thing that finally remains.
As a storyteller, yes.
Yes, as a story, but it's also important in terms of a certain set of decisions that you've made in a way about the status of the client, the idea of the realization of the building. And so I'm sure a lot of our colleagues and students know that we've also gone through a certain moment in the history of architecture where the whole question of where the idea of sort of paper architecture was something that was really part and parcel of our disciplinary practice. There were architects who, especially during the time when there really wasn't that much work, spoke of the importance of paper architecture as something and the impossibility of building. So I suppose because we're in a school of architecture and I want to be positive, I want to be euphoric, I want to be excited about the kinds of things that will happen, I want to really kind of respond to this provocation about the client and in a way a kind of the end of building and the constancy of the image, and just sort of ask you to respond to that. I don't know about the students. I can see that one is torn. For example, when you really do try so many things and then you see that there's a world of compromise. There is a world of mediocrity there. And so how do you keep up a certain standard, a certain commitment to things, a certain set of values and practices? And in a way, I guess the question is, are you of the opinion that we once again need to reinforce the importance of the value of the image as a means of communicating our practice, and to kind of stay with that that's also another form of persistence, that's another form of not giving up? So, don't know what you...
Yes, I mean, that is the main message of this lecture, but on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, naturally, there are and there have been good clients.
That's good to know.
They don't come very often.
Yes.
Generally I found that it was really much more easy working for governments than for private individuals who work for profit, who are interested in the profit. Some of them pretend to be interested in architecture, but I found that the pretense is really overwhelmingly hypocritical. Working for governments proved to be, like even for the Greek government, it was a very rewarding period when I worked for a particular minister who himself was an architect. He was very appreciative and very constructive and very positive. The problem with Greek politics is that the next government comes and it's the other party, and then it cancels everything that the previous party had put in start doing. So this is the disadvantage. But working for governments, of course, is much better than working for than working for individual clients who are interested in the profits that they're going to make, or whose primary interest is the profits they're going to make. As for the importance of the image through the history of architecture, we have examples right through the history. And for instance, in the most critical revolutionary period of the 20th century, we have Ivan Leonidov, for instance, who built nothing except for a staircase, a stairwell, but who nevertheless produced the most powerful architectural projects of the whole constructivist period. I think that, of course, architecture is a physical entity, I mean, made of stone, concrete, or whatever you have. But it is also ideas. And I am very interested in the ideas, and I'm interested in the way of communicating the ideas, and also the way in which the image can convey a lot of theory without words. Incidentally, I mean, also something that I didn't mention, but perhaps the work showed that I've always used, we always made paintings, you know, so, and most of the early stuff was done before the computers, was done with acrylic, or sometimes a lot of watercolors. Madelon worked with watercolors. I worked with acrylic, sometimes even with oil. And I continue to do things by hand. I've never learned a computer program like for what's it called, AutoCAD or any of these things. But what I did do is I've learned to use Photoshop, so that from doing paintings with a brush, I do paintings with Photoshop, and I have an archive of images that I use for the Photoshop paintings, if you like, that I now do.
Great, thank you.
I don't know if there are any questions.
Please. Can you wait and speak to the mic since they're filming this? Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Here.
When you were talking about voluntary prisoners, I actually never realized that there was a competition like preceding that project. I kind of always imagined it as a sort of independent project outside of any other framework. And I found it interesting that you were describing the framework of competition as always this sort of thing that came a priori to projects or a priori to images. And I'm wondering, like, do you have, in your practice, do you ever just make images sort of out of, I mean, do you need the competition as a framework to start working on ideas or, I mean, obviously ideas exist independent of...
In principle, no.
Yeah.
But in practice, it turns out to be yes, because it's not. It doesn't come from an individual client who wants to either do something for profit or his or her own house the way that they have dreamt it. But again, thinking of their own interests. But it's. These competitions seem to be open to a more, if you like, general interest. They're in the interests of society, let's say, the way they are termed. They often are, not always, but they're often interesting challenges to begin to do what, after all, what I like doing most, which is designing. Otherwise, I would not do anything.
Well, I guess I'm just curious because, can I follow up?
Yes.
Well, I'm just thinking of like sort of Corb's practice of this sort of like dialectic of his day where he like painted in the morning and then practiced architecture in the afternoon or whatever. And so I'm just curious if you have like
I mean, we don't have the discipline of Le Corbusier.
No, yeah. I'm just curious, like, would your practice differ, or does it differ if you work outside of the framework of a competition versus inside of?
Of course. I mean, we had an office. And we were working for clients. Yeah, we were working. We were working office hours with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm okay. So.
Then if you're going to follow up, speak to the mic. That's good. Go.
I mean, but not in like a pragmatic sort of day-to-day sense, but like, do the ideas change significantly, or does the type of representation change significantly?
Throughout one's life.
No, just depending on what if you're
more
working
asking about the conditions that what generates a project. Is it that you need the impetus of a competition to make a project, or what happens if you don't have the impetus and you generate the project? And what is the difference between different ways in which you start working for a client, doing a competition, having the impetus to begin your own project? Something.
It's a good question. Yes, I got it. It's a good question because I mean I should say that in theory that I don't need the competition, but it turned out that I've used the competition did serve as a stimulus. I have not done this kind of ideal condition that I think you're referring to, in which out of a desire, nothing more, I started doing a project. Yeah. I have not been that brave. No.
Please, Anthony. Yeah. Thank you.
First off, foremost, thank you. It was great. I've been waiting for Exodus to be shown on a big screen at this school
you
for a
told
long
me
time.
yesterday.
Yeah,
Yes.
was very excited. I think I'm going to follow up on the statement of you giving up on clients, which I found was comical. Just to have a response was the projects you did before that seemed to be the ones that were chasing clients, I guess we could say, seemed to be very abstract. And then the frustration of you saying, I'm tired of this, I'm going to give up on clients.
Well, yes, I mean, this competition for the Flemish administration center was done with incredible enthusiasm to see it built, to put it up, to kind of see it realizing there, you know, and it was on the next to the bus station and railway station of the city of Leuven. I mean, it was a dream.
Well, what seemed amazing is that when you gave up on clients, then your representation became even more realistic than the ones that were done before you gave up on clients. So when you showed the peer project at the end, that seemed more possible than the projects before the clients were given up on.
I see, right.
And I found that interesting that when you gave up on them, you almost wanted to show them what could have been if they would have employed you. But I wonder what the function of an image is when it was joined as an option to convey architecture to maybe architecture, and what architecture was to convey the image to client. And it seemed there was a drastic shift, maybe
well,
opposite.
I think you're exaggerating.
Probably.
And I wasn't aware of this shift. So I can't answer the question, but I mean, I can see that you have a point, yes. That there was yeah.
Any? Please. Yeah,
I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about Berlin, and giving the fact that in that time it kind of was ground to many kind of visionary, theoretical, experimental projects. Yours, Raymond Abram, Libius Woods, another project by Koolhaas Haydak. So, and it's kind of clear why. But what I really want to get to is, we have, let's say, not a condition like Berlin today, but we have enough other political problems, divisions, so on. Where do you think architects can fit in that sense today, in the political realm that we're dealing with today? And also, why are you not sort of engaging with these kind of issues like Berlin, given the fact that it seems that it's both for you and Rem almost like an originary kind of rift that from where your career started?
I don't think there is an equivalent condition to what Berlin was at the time today. Is there?
Really, you don't think that the refugee crisis, what's happening in Greece, all the stuff that is being discussed about Mexico and the wall.
These are yes, of course, they're phenomenally important issues, but they're so intertwined with politics and with political ambitions. And I'm afraid to say with the ambitions of this country to dominate and also to a certain extent trigger a lot of these crises. But I think the problem about the refugees in general and then about is it is so important politically, and that kind of architecture is not yet ready to handle, to respond to such a. I mean, I think that one has to sort out whether there's going to be a kind of an international condition of looking for international peace rather than provoking conditions of potential war.
Mm-hmm. Maybe one issue, Elia, that is that's worth asking your reaction is really, when you talk about the image, is to also talk about the interrelationship between the image and the text, or the image and the script, which is the first part of your lecture, and the necessity of narration
yes.
as a way of constructing the space between the images, which is very, very, very important. because I think we spend a lot of time talking about the brief and the program, but then there is really the kind of the scenario setting, the situational
Yes, the narrative.
conditions of narrative. And because also I think for the students, I don't know if you're aware of the fact that during, let's say, the 70s, there is this discussion about the image and the text, the image and the script, but there is also a discussion around the whole idea of narrative architecture, and architecture which would be focusing a lot on questions of narration, which is different than what I think Elia and Rem were doing, which is building on the interrelationship between text and image. So some of the things that came from Bernard Tschumi's discussions of disjunction and so on then were part of what people like Nigel Coates picked up and, you know, then talked about narrative architecture, which was, which really didn't have the same, I don't know, it seems to me that it didn't have the same, at least the same intentions in terms
no,
of...
it kind of was branching into its
Something.
own world.
Yeah.
But actually, talking of Berlin, there were many issues which are very much to do with the German, a certain German obsession, which was embedded in the whole ideology of the IBA, the Internationale Bauausstellung, which was dedicated to restoring Berlin to what it was before the war, before the wall, before all these scars. And at the same time, this kind of a desire for amnesia, which was really very painful to watch, and something that we really tried in many projects that we did, and the many lectures that we gave in Berlin and about Berlin, tried to kind of counter and to discuss. Like, for instance, Berlin had an incredibly interesting townscape left after the war, after the bombing. The bombing of that city was so ferocious that it left a kind of cityscape that was very poignant, and which also had a lot of beauty. And it had a certain historical importance, but they wanted to erase every trace of it. Even then, when the wall came down, they wanted to I mean, I remember I was very close friends with Hans Koloff, who had been my contact architect for the Checkpoint Charlie building. He was in charge of the executive of the building while I was not there, and we're very close friends. We happened to go to Berlin because we had been invited to some other competition, which again we won, and we didn't, for Moabit Verde. We won, but never so realized, a typical Berlin condition. I mean, Berlin and Brussels are probably the most corrupt cities I've known, even more corrupt than Athens. At least at that time, when the wall came down, we had some very nice ideas of how the whole of that space, that ring around Berlin, could become a kind of a very important public space. But no way. I mean, Hans, when he came to pick us up at the airport 2 days after the wall had fallen, and we said, "Look, it's a fantastic opportunity." He became so furious. No, we have to erase every trace. We have to build over the space of where the wall was and kind of and erase the trace. In other words, amnesia, to generate amnesia. Berlin was an incredibly interesting city to test ideas and ideologies, But no, that was not what they wanted. It was, yeah.
I'm Conscious of time, this has been a really wonderful afternoon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you
for
very
being
much. Thank
here.
you.
Thank you, Elia.